China just issued a warning that hasn't been heard in 80 years. Today, the Japanese government officially advised fishermen to stay away from the Senkaku Islands. Not because of bad weather, not because of environmental concerns, but because China and Japan are on the brink of military conflict. And this morning, a classified assessment from the People's Liberation Army was leaked to defense analysts. The conclusion is stunning. China no longer views Japan as just another American ally in the Pacific. Japan is now classified as a direct military threat to Chinese national security. This is the highest level of tension between China and Japan since World War II ended 80 years ago. And what makes this truly terrifying is that China is accusing Japan of secretly pursuing nuclear weapons. They've published a 29-page intelligence report claiming that right-wing forces in Tokyo are trying to build atomic bombs. And Beijing has made it clear, if Japan goes nuclear, China will respond with military force. Let me bring you up to speed on what's happening right now, because the Asia-Pacific region is moving closer to war than at any point in the last 8 decades. This crisis began on November 7, 2025, when Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, made a statement in Parliament that sent shockwaves through Beijing. A member of the opposition asked her a simple question. What would Japan do if China attacked Taiwan? Her answer changed everything. Prime Minister Takaichi said that a Chinese military operation against Taiwan would create a situation threatening Japan's survival. And she added that under those circumstances, Japan would have the legal right to use military force in collective self-defense. Let me translate what that means. For decades, Japan has maintained strategic ambiguity about Taiwan. Japanese officials would privately tell the United States that they understood Taiwan's importance. They would quietly provide intelligence support. They would allow American forces to use Japanese bases. But they never, ever said publicly that Japan would fight China to defend Taiwan, until now. Prime Minister Takaichi didn't just cross a red line, she erased it entirely, and China's response has been swift, comprehensive, and escalating. Within 48 hours of Takaichi's statement, China's foreign ministry summoned the Japanese ambassador to Beijing. Foreign Minister Wang Yi personally delivered a warning. Japan's comments were completely unacceptable and represented a dangerous provocation. But that was just the beginning. On December 9th, Chinese and Russian bombers conducted a joint military exercise. 2 Russian Tupolev Tu-95 strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons flew alongside 2 Chinese H-6 bombers and 4 Chinese J-16 fighter jets. They passed through the Miyako Strait between Japan's main islands and entered the Pacific Ocean. This wasn't a routine patrol. This was a message. Russia and China are coordinating their military operations in Japanese airspace. The United States responded immediately. 2 American B-52 bombers flew joint missions with Japanese F-35 and F-15 fighters. The Japanese Defense Ministry issued a statement saying they were demonstrating strong resolve to prevent any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force. But the military posturing was only one dimension of China's pressure campaign. Beijing also launched a comprehensive diplomatic offensive targeting Japan's international relationships. On November 27th, Foreign Minister Wang Yi called France's presidential policy advisor, Emmanuel Bon. He demanded that Paris reaffirm its commitment to the One China principle and warned against any support for Japan's position on Taiwan. The next day, Wang called the United Kingdom's national security advisor, Jonathan Powell. He told London that Japan was trying to exploit the Taiwan question, the very territory Japan colonized for half a century, committing countless crimes against the Chinese people. On December 9th, Wang told Germany's foreign minister that Prime Minister Takaichi was attempting to provoke trouble and threaten China militarily. China wasn't just pressuring Japan, it was isolating Japan diplomatically, trying to ensure that no major European power would support Tokyo in a conflict. But that's not all. China also activated economic warfare tactics. In early December, Chinese authorities quietly began canceling cultural events involving Japan. A major exhibition of Studio Ghibli films in Guangzhou was canceled. A Pokemon trading card game tournament scheduled for Shanghai was postponed indefinitely. The 2 giant pandas at Tokyo's Ueno Zoo, Xiao Xiao and Lei Lei, were ordered to return to China ahead of schedule. Pandas are a symbol of Chinese soft power. Their early withdrawal was a deliberate signal of Beijing's displeasure. And then came the most significant economic measure. Chinese gaming company MiHoYo, the creator of the massively popular game Honkai Star Rail, announced a 2-week delay for a major update that was supposed to introduce a new region with Japanese cultural themes. The company apologized to players and issued in-game compensation. This might sound trivial, but MiHoYo is a multi-billion-dollar company with hundreds of millions of players worldwide. The fact that they felt compelled to delay content because of government pressure tells you how seriously China is taking this crisis. But the diplomatic and economic pressure campaigns were just warming up. On January 8th, 2026, China escalated to a whole new level. The China Arms Control and Disarmament Association, working with the China Institute of Nuclear Industry Strategy, published a 29-page intelligence report titled Nuclear Ambitions of Japan's Right-Wing Forces, a Serious Threat to World Peace. The report makes explosive accusations. It claims that conservative forces within the Japanese government are actively pursuing nuclear weapons capability. It alleges that Japan has been stockpiling weapons-grade plutonium under the cover of its civilian nuclear energy program. And it argues that Prime Minister Takaichi's government represents a dangerous revival of Japanese militarism. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Mao Ning held a press conference the same day. She said, the Japanese right-wing forces inflating nuclear ambitions are a dangerous signal of the resurgence of militarism in Japan and pose serious threats to world peace and stability. She then issued a direct demand. The Japanese side should immediately make clear its position on the issue of nuclear weapons. This is an extraordinary accusation. Japan has maintained a strict 3 non-nuclear principles since 1967. Japan will not possess, manufacture, or allow nuclear weapons on its territory. This policy has been a cornerstone of Japan's post-World War II identity as a pacifist nation. But China is now claiming publicly and officially that Japan is abandoning those principles. And here's the terrifying part: they might be right. On December 18th, an unnamed official in the Japanese Prime Minister's office was quoted saying that Japan should consider acquiring nuclear weapons. The statement caused immediate backlash. China's foreign ministry called it a serious issue that exposes the dangerous attempts by some in Japan to breach international law. The Japanese government quickly issued a clarification saying that Japan's non-nuclear policy has not changed, but they did not fire the official who made the comment. They did not punish him. They just moved on. And that silence is what's driving China's paranoia. Because from Beijing's perspective, Japan is following a playbook that looks very similar to what other countries have done when secretly pursuing nuclear weapons. First, you stockpile fissionable material under the cover of civilian nuclear programs. Japan currently holds approximately 46 tons of separated plutonium, enough to build thousands of nuclear weapons. Second, you develop advanced missile technology. Japan is currently deploying hypersonic glide vehicles with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers missiles that could theoretically carry nuclear warheads. Third, you create political cover by framing nuclear weapons as a defensive necessity. And that's exactly what some Japanese politicians have been doing, arguing that China's military buildup and North Korea's nuclear threats require Japan to reconsider its pacifist constitution. China is watching all of this and concluding that Japan is preparing to go nuclear, and Beijing has made it absolutely clear that they will not tolerate a nuclear-armed Japan. But let me step back and explain why this crisis is so dangerous. This isn't just about Taiwan. This isn't just about nuclear weapons. This is about 80 years of unresolved historical grievances that are now colliding with present-day geopolitical realities. Japan occupied large parts of China from 1931 to 1945. During that occupation, Japanese military forces committed horrific atrocities, including the Nanjing massacre, where an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed. After World War II, Japan was supposed to face comprehensive accountability for these crimes. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, known as the Tokyo Trials, convicted 25 Japanese leaders of war crimes. But unlike Germany, which underwent decades of soul-searching and education about the Holocaust, Japan never fully reckoned with its wartime actions. Japanese history textbooks downplay or omit references to atrocities. Japanese politicians regularly visit the Yasukuni Shrine, where Class A war criminals are honored alongside regular soldiers. And conservative voices in Japan continue to dispute historical facts about events like the Nanjing massacre. China has never forgotten, and China has never forgiven. So when Prime Minister Takaichi says Japan might use military force to defend Taiwan, territory that Japan colonized from 1895 to 1945, Beijing hears echoes of Japanese imperialism. When Japanese officials talk about acquiring nuclear weapons, Beijing sees the resurgence of militarism. And when the United States pledges to support Japan in any conflict with China, Beijing views it as a continuation of the post-war order that humiliated China for a century. This is why China's National Defense Ministry spokesperson, Senior Colonel Zhang Xiaogang, said on January 16th, unchecked Japanese militarist ambitions would pose a grave threat to other Asian nations and ultimately bring disaster upon Japan itself. That's not diplomatic language. That's a warning of war. And today, January 27th, 2026, we got the clearest sign yet that both sides believe conflict is possible. Reuters reported this morning that the Japanese government has been quietly advising fishermen to avoid the Senkaku Islands, a group of uninhabited rocks in the East China Sea that both China and Japan claim as sovereign territory. Japan calls them the Senkaku Islands. China calls them the Diaoyu Islands. And control over these tiny uninhabited rocks has become a flashpoint for potential war. Why would Japan tell its own fishermen to stay away from territory it claims to control? Because Tokyo knows that if a Chinese Coast Guard vessel confronts a Japanese fishing boat, and if that confrontation turns violent, it could trigger a military response that spirals into full-scale war. This is exactly how World War I started. An assassination in Sarajevo triggered alliance obligations, which triggered mobilizations, which triggered declarations of war. Within weeks, all of Europe was engulfed in a conflict that killed 20 million people. And right now, in the East China Sea, we have a similar dynamic. China has committed to defending its territorial claims. Japan has committed to defending its territorial claims. The United States has committed to defending Japan under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And both sides have military forces on high alert. All it takes is one miscalculation, one Coast Guard captain who opens fire, one fighter pilot who locks onto a target, one commander who misinterprets radar data, and the Asia-Pacific could be at war. Let me walk you through what that war would look like. Scenario 1, limited naval conflict. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel confronts a Japanese fishing boat near the Senkaku Islands. Warning shots are fired. The Japanese Coast Guard responds. Within hours, both countries have naval vessels converging on the area. China's People's Liberation Army Navy has 134 major warships, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines. Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force has 72 major warships, smaller in number but technologically advanced. The initial engagement would likely be confined to the waters around the Senkaku Islands. Both sides would try to avoid escalation. But if either side suffers significant casualties, if a destroyer is sunk, if hundreds of sailors are killed, domestic political pressure would force both governments to retaliate, and that's when the conflict goes regional. Scenario 2, air and missile war. If the naval conflict escalates, both sides would activate their air forces and missile arsenals. China has approximately 1,270 modern combat aircraft. Japan has 320, but Japan's F-35 stealth fighters and F-15 interceptors are among the most advanced in the world. China would likely launch ballistic missiles targeting Japanese air bases and command centers. Japan would respond with its newly deployed Type 12 missiles, which have ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers and can strike targets deep inside China. The United States would almost certainly intervene at this stage. American forces based in Japan, including the 7th Fleet and the 5th Air Force, would come under direct attack. And under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, America would be obligated to defend Japan. At that point, you're looking at a war involving the world's 3 largest economies, the United States, China, and Japan. Scenario 3, Taiwan joins the fight. If China and Japan are already at war, Beijing would have a strong incentive to solve the Taiwan problem at the same time. Chinese military planners have been preparing for a Taiwan invasion scenario for decades. They know that the United States would struggle to fight 2 major wars simultaneously, one defending Japan and one defending Taiwan. So if war breaks out over the Senkaku Islands, China might launch a massive amphibious assault on Taiwan, while American forces are already engaged. Taiwan has been preparing for this scenario as well. The island has anti-ship missiles, advanced air defenses, and a well-trained military. But Taiwan is only 100 miles from mainland China. If the People's Liberation Army commits its full strength, hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of aircraft, and the entire Chinese Navy, Taiwan cannot hold out indefinitely without American support. And that creates a horrifying dilemma for Washington. Does the United States fight a 2-front war against China, defending both Japan and Taiwan, knowing that such a conflict could go nuclear? Or does America prioritize one ally over the other, effectively abandoning Taiwan or Japan to Chinese military action? There are no good answers. Let me tell you what the experts are saying right now. This morning, Geopolitical Futures, one of the most respected strategic forecasting organizations in the world, published an analysis titled, "To China, Japan is a Big Threat." The report notes that this represents a meaningful shift in how China views Japan. For years, Beijing saw Tokyo primarily as an American proxy, a country that followed Washington's lead but had no independent strategic ambitions. That assessment has now changed. China's military planners now view Japan as a direct threat, a country capable of intervening militarily in a Taiwan conflict and potentially acquiring nuclear weapons. And that shift in perception is incredibly dangerous. Because if China believes Japan is becoming a nuclear-armed military power aligned with the United States, then Beijing has a strong incentive to act preemptively, to weaken Japan before it becomes too strong. This is the same logic that led to World War I, World War II, and nearly every major conflict in history. When a rising power believes its window of opportunity is closing, it becomes more willing to take risks. And right now, China believes its window is closing. The United States is strengthening its alliance network in the Pacific. Japan is rebuilding its military. South Korea is increasing defense spending. Taiwan is buying advanced weapons. And all of them are coordinating their efforts to contain China. From Beijing's perspective, if they wait 5 or 10 years, the military balance could shift decisively against them. So if China is going to act, it needs to act soon. That's why defense analysts are watching 2027 so closely. Chinese President Xi Jinping has reportedly ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready to seize Taiwan by 2027. That deadline is less than 2 years away. And now, with Japan openly saying it would defend Taiwan, China has to factor Japanese military intervention into its war plans. So what should you be watching in the coming weeks and months? First, does Japan change its nuclear policy? If Prime Minister Takaichi or any senior official makes another statement about acquiring nuclear weapons, even hypothetically, that will trigger an immediate crisis with China. Second, watch military exercises. If China conducts large-scale amphibious drills near Taiwan, or if Japan conducts joint exercises with the United States simulating a Taiwan defense scenario, those are signs that both sides are preparing for conflict. Third, watch the Senkaku Islands. If Chinese Coast Guard vessels increase their presence, or if Japan deploys additional naval forces to the area, that tells you both countries are willing to risk confrontation. Fourth, watch the United States. The Pentagon just released its 2026 National Defense Strategy, which downgraded China from the top threat and prioritized defending the Western Hemisphere. But if war breaks out between China and Japan, Washington will be forced to choose: honor its treaty obligations to Japan or stay out of an Asian conflict. Fifth, watch Russia. Moscow and Beijing conducted joint bomber flights over Japanese airspace in December. If Russia continues to coordinate military operations with China, that signals a deepening anti-American alliance that could extend beyond the Pacific. And finally, watch the economic indicators. If Japanese companies start evacuating personnel from China, or if China starts restricting exports of critical minerals to Japan, those are signs that both governments are preparing for a long-term confrontation. Let me put this in the starkest possible terms. China and Japan are the world's second and third largest economies. Together, they account for nearly 20% of global GDP. A war between them would not be a regional conflict. It would be a global catastrophe. Supply chains would collapse, stock markets would crash, energy prices would skyrocket, and if the United States gets drawn in, which it almost certainly would, you're looking at World War III. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't fear-mongering. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists recently moved the doomsday clock to 89 seconds to midnight, the closest to nuclear war humanity has ever been. And one of the primary reasons they cited was escalating tensions in the Asia-Pacific. China is accusing Japan of pursuing nuclear weapons. Japan is saying it will defend Taiwan militarily. The United States is pledging to support Japan. And all three countries have massive military forces on high alert. The ingredients for catastrophic war are all present. What's missing so far is the spark. But as we saw today, with the Japanese government warning fishermen to avoid the Senkaku Islands, both sides know that spark could come at any moment. One fishing boat, one Coast Guard vessel, one miscalculation, that's all it takes. And unlike the Cold War, where the United States and Soviet Union had decades to develop crisis management protocols and direct communication channels, China and Japan have no such mechanisms. There is no hotline between Tokyo and Beijing. There are no regular military-to-military talks. There is no framework for de-escalation. If shooting starts, both sides will be improvising. And that is exactly how small conflicts become world wars. So here's what you need to understand. The Asia-Pacific is moving toward war, not because anyone wants war, but because historical grievances, territorial disputes, alliance obligations, and nuclear ambitions are all converging at the same time. China believes Japan is becoming a threat. Japan believes China is becoming a threat. And both of them are probably right. The question is not whether tensions will continue to rise. The question is whether leaders in Beijing, Tokyo, and Washington have the wisdom and restraint to prevent those tensions from exploding into violence. Right now, the signs are not encouraging. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because what happens in the East China Sea over the next few months could determine whether we enter an era of great power war or find a way to step back from the brink. This is the most dangerous moment in Asia-Pacific geopolitics since World War II, and the world is not paying enough attention.